double checking. There we go. Yep, cool. Okay. Welcome to the webinar on OAI PMH today. I'm Deborah Fitchett from Lincoln University in New Zealand, and I'm still working out how to control this slide. There we go. So I'm going to start off today's webinar with an introduction to what OAI PMH actually is, and then I'll hand over to the other presenters to talk about how they've been using it. So as librarians, we all love acronyms, but this is a particularly unwieldy one. So it stands for Open Archives Initiative Protocol for Metadata Harvesting. In other words, it's an open access standard. It describes a way to let metadata be harvested from a data provider to a harvester.
Very reasonable, but I would
that
do the same.
Might be harvesting data from your server system into an external system, or it might be harvesting data from an external system into your system, or harvesting data from one of your systems into another one. There's a whole lot of information on the Open Archives Initiative website at this link, including the full technical specification. You can use that to help troubleshoot. So I've actually spent a whole lot of time in there and very geeky about it. So being geeky, I wanted to show an overview of how OAI PMH actually works. And if diagrams like this make your eyes glaze over, then just cover your eyes up. The main thing you need to know is that the website that's harvesting the data sends a request saying, show me what you've got. The website that's providing the data then responds saying, here it is. So in a bit more detail, the request that the harvester sends is just a URL. It means for troubleshooting purposes, you can actually paste it into your own browser and see what response you get and whether there's anything in the response. It starts with the base URL, OAI feed. So that's everything before the question mark, your.repo.ac.nz/OAI. Then it includes several parameters to narrow down exactly what data you want. So in orange, there's the verbs, say what kind of data. In green, the set lets you narrow down to a specific collection on your website. In blue, the from and until dates let you get items added between specific dates or even specific timestamps. And in grey, the metadata prefix lets you specify what metadata format you want. Most likely you'll be working with Dublin Core, but in some systems you can get really fancy and create your own format. Response always comes in XML. So that can be the response to an identity request. It tells you about the data provider. So that might be the website name, a contact email address, and so forth. List sets, these start getting pretty much what they say on the box. It just gives you a list of the collections on the website. List identifiers lists the identifiers of the available items. And list metadata formats lists the formats that the data provider can respond with. To get the metadata itself, you would use list records if you want a whole set of records, or get record if you just want one specific record. So that's the technical stuff over with, so you can open your eyes again. Most of the time, once you've configured the base URL, the systems are just going to talk to each other and handle all of that technical stuff for you. Although, obviously, if it was that simple, we wouldn't have the whole session here, probably. But I'm just going to finish up my introduction with some examples of the possibilities. So some of the websites that are set up to harvest data with OAI PMH include Primo. In New Zealand, we have Digital NZ, and in Australia, you've got Trove. Oyster is a really cool OCLC site which aggregates open access content from all over the world. I understand the Australia National Bibliographic Database also uses this, and there's a whole lot of other harvesters. There's even more data providers. So research repositories like DSpace, e-prints and so forth, heritage sites, content DM, Recollect, all sorts of other special collections. So whether that's Figshare, open journal systems, Equella, and then Ex Libris products like Rosetta, Alma Digital, and Alma. And you can even, once as Lincoln, we even converted our WordPress RSS feed into an OAI feed, so we could harvest and index our library website in Primo. So any website with a little bit of coding can actually be turned into an OAI feed. So today we're going to look at a few of these possibilities. David and Peter are going to talk about using OAI to provide data to Trove and the Australian National Bibliographic Database. Then we'll hear about harvesting data from Figshare to Primo from David, and from Rosetta to Alma from Mike. And after that, Bronwyn will talk about publishing data from Rapidil and Recollect into Primo. And Rich will talk about publishing it from Alma to the National Library of New Zealand Search and Rosetta. So David, if you're ready, I'll just hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I am ready. So very quick introduction. My name is David Witterveen. I am the coordinator of library discovery platforms at La Trobe University Library. And I should say, before I get started on this, setting up harvesting for Trove was my second ever encounter with OAI PMH. I'm going to talk about my first encounter, and the problems we ran into with Figshare. Let's just say that Figshare was not a success, but the Trove one was. So very quickly, the goal was to get Libraries Australia to automatically harvest our physical holdings from Alma and add them to Trove. And we wanted to do that so that people could search in Trove, they could see that we had a holding there, and they could request that through library sharing. Sorry, resource sharing. Before we set up OAI PMH, I'm going to stumble saying that so many times today, I do apologize. Before we set that up, we were doing that manually. Our collections team were creating a big FTP file once a week and FTPing it up to Trove. So we wanted to automate that part of the process. This is the process in theory. And you start off, you place a request with Trove saying, hey, we would like to set up OAI PMH harvesting. They send you a questionnaire, which you fill out. It's got about, I think, 10 or 15 questions in it about what you want to harvest, what you're trying to achieve, that sort of thing. You then need to, or we need to create a set in Alma. For those Alma administrators out there, we created a set, which is the set of items that we want to send up to Trove. We need to also configure the OAI integration in Alma and create a publishing profile in Alma. Once that's all set up, you pass those details to Trove and you harvest away. Listed like that, it all looks very straightforward and simple. And it's not that it wasn't, it's just that in reality, it took a lot longer than we thought it was, partly because I didn't know what we were doing and we were trying to work it out. Also partly because Trove were very busy. So you work with a Trove technical consultant, but they're also working on other projects. There were several times during this project where there would be radio silence for 3 or 4 weeks and you sort of forgot what was happening, or we had other projects interrupt. So I'm not going to read through that big list there, but you can see it basically took 6 months to get the actual thing set up in the end. I also got long COVID during that, which didn't help. Don't recommend that. Don't get long COVID. I have put down here, though, the thing that was very important is reading the instructions from Ex Libris. I only found out these instructions like halfway through the process, which seems weird. But yeah, we got there in the end. I do want to point, oh, sorry, I've gone too far. Go back. All right. I want to point out something. I don't know if you can read that here, but these instructions are created by Peter Hopkins and co-authored with Amelia Rowe, who are 2 ANZREG members. Yes. Oh, sorry, I've jumped forward again. But you can see here that these instructions are great. So if you're thinking about doing this and you have Alma, search for these instructions, find these instructions, click the link in these notes, because they will tell you everything you need to do. And some of these are things that I hadn't done, and that's why we ran into problems. But as I said, basically in terms of the Alma side, you're creating the set, you set up an OAI integration, you allow Trove's IP addresses to access that OAI integration, you create a publishing profile, and then you send those details to Trove and they can take it from there. I'm going to jump back very briefly to the previous slide. It should point out that the initial harvest, so they did a test harvest, made sure it worked, then they actually harvested all our records. That took 8 days, about 10 days, I think, once they actually did the testing. So it takes a long time. We had about I can't remember if it was 1.7 or 1.9 million records that we were uploading. Someone has put a question in the chat, and I don't want to get too sidetracked by the chat, but we found the question about did they remove original records? Obviously, we had holdings there before. They did, but there were some problems, and there was a cleanup process, is what we found in the end. So it wasn't completely straightforward. But if you have a look at what I've listed in the January section, there was a bit of a cleanup process at the end. All right, so that's the instructions from Ex Libris. The end result. This is on the right. Sorry, I had to work out which side is left and right. On the right there is what a holding now looks like in Trove. So if you click the borrow, if you search for an item, you click the borrow button, you can see that La Trobe University Library is now listed as one of the holders, one of the people who hold that item. And if you click that link, it takes you straight to the record in Primo. So, and then people can place the resource sharing request in there. The holdings are updated every night now rather than once a week. We no longer have to manually create the FTP file and upload it. We do still have some things that we haven't finished. So I mentioned before that you create a set of the items that you want to upload. That is still a manual process for us because we have things that we do want to list and things that we don't want to list. We are looking at improving that. And there's a bug in Trove at the moment that means we don't get the harvest report emails. I'm not sure when they're going to fix that, but if we haven't received a report saying your harvests are working. We know they are because we've tested it, but we haven't seen a report. And that, I think, is it for me. I'll just double check. I can't remember. Oh yeah, conclusion. So my advice is allow plenty of time. Read the instructions from Ex Libris. You can do a lot of that work, the creating the set, the configuring the integration, creating the publishing profile. You can do a lot of that beforehand. Also, document your process so you know what you're doing. I'm a big fan of documentation. And the bonus from this project is we are currently setting up Rapid ILL, another Ex Libris product that uses OAI PMH harvesting to record which resources you want to share through Rapid ILL. And so everything I've learned from the Trove project is now applicable to this Rapid ILL project. Do we want to answer questions or do we want to move to the next speaker?
I have lost all visibility of the Zoom meeting. So I'm just going to escape out of the slides briefly. And
that's all right, Claire, I can. There is one question, says from Susan Gore, how do you account for withdrawn or deleted items?
I'm not sure. Ella, you might be able to answer that question. Ella is the collections team at La Trobe University Library. So Ella and I work very closely on this. Sorry.
We do know there is a problem that some of our withdrawn stuff is showing as holdings, mainly because we have suppressed it at a item level and not a bibliographic level. So the bib record is still being sent to Trove and then they're being sent back to La Trobe and it says we can't find this item. So yeah, we're working on that. Still a work in progress is the answer, I guess.
But normally, in general, OAI can flag an item as being deleted or withdrawn. So that should go through to the harvester and the harvester should then say, okay, that item's been withdrawn, I won't display that anymore. But it does also somewhat depend on the two systems behaving themselves.
Yeah. There's another question. Do you use an Alma NR to generate the 984s? I hope you know what that means, because I don't.
I apologise, I don't know what that means.
Normalization rule.
Ah, right.
No, I mean, sorry, I'll be honest, I don't actually genuinely do not know. But I don't think we use any normalization rules to send the set to Ellie. You're the one who's created the set.
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you maintain your 984s in your mark records, or is it another? You do it another way.
What do you mean by 984? As in
Sorry,
where you put the nut. Yeah,
maybe,
sorry,
that's all right. If I maybe I can talk a little bit about that as I go on, because we're in the process of doing it right now. So, and I've been tangling with 984s and normalization rules.
But I also think that Trove can do some manipulation of your data when they import it as well. So it's possible. Like, a good question, but also something we didn't talk about. They can do some manipulation of the data at their end. So it's possible that they're adding that for us.
Mm-hmm.
Did I mention this is all fairly new to me? So but it's working mostly. All right, that's me. Peter?
Okay, thank you. So I'm Peter Hopkins, the Manager of Digital Library Services at Bond University, and I want to acknowledge the Kombumerri people, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which the university now stands. So I'm going to just recap a little bit on our timeline, I guess, with OAI PMH and Trove, and hopefully I can pick up some of those questions as I go along. So we migrated from Aleph to Alma in 2015, and from that point on, we were publishing our physical holdings via the record import service to the National Library. We were using the standard Alma Libraries Australia publishing profile, and that ran weekly and created the FTP files, the files which were FTP'd to the National Library for their processing. At some point, I'm not sure exactly the date on that, but we did start contributing electronic holdings as well, but only for our Bond University theses. We don't contribute journal holdings at all, for various reasons, including usability, user experience for Trove users. Those electronic holdings were added into the Alma Libraries Australia publishing profile. So that publishing profile was created by Ex Libris, and there was very little, or there was nothing we could do apart from add a few little parameters to it about what our NUC symbol was, things like that. In 2018, we started using Alma Digital for our small but growing collection of digitizations. Now, most of these are from the Bond University archives, so they're photographs or old publications, and they're unique resources. So bear that in mind when we start thinking about, are we deleting records or holdings here? For those things, very extremely unlikely that we will ever want those records deleted. So that hasn't been a big issue for us to date. The other things that are in Alma Digital are some journals, open access journals that have ceased publications, and they used to be in our Digital Commons repository. Okay, 2019, we asked Ex Libris to add digital resources to the Libraries Australia publishing profile so that they could be added using the same record import service. And Ex Libris said, we don't like the idea of doing this. We have general publishing profiles which are perfectly capable of handling this. Please go ahead and do that. And so that kicked off a whole heap of conversations amongst the ANZREG community and with Ex Libris. So we ended up having some meetings and correspondence with Ex Libris, including Yoel Kortik and Dan Greenberg. RMIT, so Amelia was involved in this, Lucy Camel from the University of Western Australia. I can't remember all the names, but there were some other people as well. Trove Collaborative Services, I think Eb Carter's at that stage was involved in the early discussions, and then later on Mel Hunt joined in and did the actual work with us. So we had to talk through this use of the general publishing profile instead. As I said, Ex Libris said, use the general publishing profile. So Lucy Camel had identified that there was a problem with that because it did not support being able to name the files for deletion and for new records in the format that the National Library wanted. And so we felt like we were stuck in a bit of a bind at that point. However, as conversations went on with the National Library, they decided that they wanted to kick off their OAI PMH daily update pilot at that time and said that they would prefer us to use that. And so that was like, yay, we can actually get going again on this one. In 2020, we commenced publishing and harvesting. And for us, this was just digital resources. So we had most of them in MARC and some of them in Dublin Core. So the ones that we'd migrated from our Digital Commons repository were Dublin Core records. So we had 2 different record formats to deal with. And I do want to mention there that the outcomes of all this is what generated the documentation that David referenced. So Amelia and I wrote that and contributed it to the Community Knowledge Centre, which now is no longer able to be added to. And we presented on it along with Mel Hunt from National Library at the Igloo conference that year. And then we gave an update as things had also moved along in the ANZREG 2020 virtual conference as well. So there are slides and recordings there available from then if people want to go and have a look at those as well. The ANZREG ones are the most recent, so get them from the ANZREG website. Come on, slides, move along. There we go. Okay, so, it's gone too far. So because we had 2 different record formats, there were different pathways for this. So from our perspective, in Alma, we're publishing them as different sets with different publishing profiles in an OAI PMH format. And then depending on the record format, Trove or the National Library picks up those records, harvests them, and does different things with them. So if they're MARC, they are added into the Australian National Bibliographic Database. If they're Dublin Core records, they just go straight into Trove. So they're handled quite differently. So this means we have 2 separate harvest streams. The data enrichment for the MARC records includes a delivery URL and a thumbnail URL. So for digital resources, this means the thumbnail can be displayed in Trove. So that's great. At this currently, this set is defined with an access rule that says if it equals open access and the record format equals MARC, then publish it. And what you can, hopefully it's not too small, but what you can see below on that slide is the out of the box data enrichment for digital resources. We just said, it looks like this, Mel, and Mel said, okay, I can do some stuff with it. So at this stage, they're taking that subfield G, which has main, which is our main library. I don't think we've got anything digital resources in the law library, but if we did, they would just take it and replace it with our NUC symbol, our National Union Catalogue symbol. Normalization rules at this stage. Okay, so our records that are in Dublin Core, the output only includes a delivery URL and it is output in an identifier field. So Trove makes the transformation at their end to create a thumbnail URL based on the MMS ID in one of the identifiers in the record. So we can't do anything with that. They have to take care of that. But that was something that Mel wanted to do. And we're pleased because once again, it means thumbnails appear in Trove. And so this set is easily defined as open access and the record format equals Dublin Core. And I've put a link when you get the slides, I've put a link there as well to another article that Amelia and I wrote, which is focusing on the Dublin Core record. So if you need to do that, that's also available through the Ex Libris site from the community knowledge. Just looking at the output down below, that's not just the holdings, that's the whole entire record. So that's what they take, and they do their magic with that to transform it to make it work for Trove. Right, so what I'm currently doing at the moment is trying to consolidate MARC records that we contribute through the RIS, the record import service, and our digital MARC records into a single harvest stream. So the physical inventory is the bulk of our titles. The electronic holdings is pretty much just the Bond University theses, and the digital is the Bond University archives, the historic sort of stuff that's already being contributed through OAI PMH. So the challenge is how to define the sets. You actually can define 2 sets when you're putting a publishing profile together, but it's a maximum of 2 sets. So I'm having to redefine now how we do that set. We're going to stop talking about, is it open access or not? And we're going to make sure that all our open access digital resources have the tag sync national catalogue equals published bibliographic records. And we're going to rely on that as the key element. And the record format still needs to be MARC 21 because we don't want to pick up the Dublin core records in this set as well. So that's where we're aiming. However, this change also means that we have to deal with normalization rules now, and they work across all of the inventory types when you're producing a consolidated set. So you need to be careful. All right, so the goals that we want to do here is we want to minimize the number of harvest streams. Partially this is because of the costs. If you have more than a certain number of allocated harvest streams, then your Trove membership fees go up. So we've undertaken to consolidate. We also at the same time want to move to using a single NUC symbol instead of one for each of our main library and law library. We want to simplify the user experience for people looking at Trove, and for libraries who want to request from us. We only have one resource sharing library and it's Cubon, and so we may as well just put that in Trove. The implications are that the normalization rules can't be avoided. We want a single holding statement, even if the title is in multiple locations. So we have very thankfully used some shared normalization rules from Macquarie University, which is helping us with that. And also the physical records have come from many multiple sources, and some have been migrated from earlier systems. And so they bring along a bit of baggage with them, and we do need to clean up some of that baggage. So I've now had to start dealing much more with normalization rules this time around. I'll echo what David said. It takes much longer than you think, with sometimes weeks in between support requests and answers or resolutions. And so it makes it really hard when you're trying to remember and understand what notes you've taken about your normalization rules. But anyway, we're getting there. I would recommend that if you start to do this, you can break up your normalization rules into chunks. So we're going with a first step, which is let's clean up the bib data. And then the second step, which is, okay, let's manipulate the holdings data now to do what we need it to do. I will add that not all libraries are contributing holdings using 984 tags, though you might be told to do that. And in fact, that was one of the things, was like, you have to use 984 tags. But the rules that Macquarie had shared with me was putting them into 850 tags. So I queried it and they said, actually, yes, you're correct. So yeah, there are different ways around this. What else can I say? What was the other question about normalization rules? Let's make sure I cover that. It's moved on. There's so many things in the chat now. So I will just, I just want to say a big thank you to the University of Notre Dame, Queensland University of Technology, and Macquarie University for all sharing normalization rules with me. That saved me a huge amount of headaches, and I learned a lot through the process. Now, someone has said, to clarify, is tag sync national catalogue meaning to export to Libraries Australia management? option in the MDE menu. It's when you're looking at a record at the top. I think it's record actions, perhaps somewhere in there. You can set flags, and it's in there.
Yeah, so when I think the question was, are they the same thing? And they are. So when you're doing a advanced search to create the set, it's called tag sync national catalog, but when you're in metadata editor, it's called the export to Libraries Australia, just to make it more complicated.
Okay. All right. I think that's it from me, unless I've missed someone's question there, but you might have to bring it to my attention.
Yeah, so the question about normalization rules was, do you use a normalization rule to generate the 984s?
Yeah, so the holdings data, when you set up the profile, you get to a data enrichment page and you go, okay, for my physical holdings, you tell Alma where to grab the data from. And this is where Macquarie really helped me out with what they're doing. So we're grabbing the data from the Alma holdings record, not from a bib record, and it pushes it out. So it's like a virtual record that you're publishing. It's not actually what you've got in Alma. So that pushes it all into an 850 tag, not a 984 tag. You move down to your next type of holdings data, so your electronic holdings, and then you configure what you want it to do with that. And then you go down to the digital holdings and you tell it what you want it to do with that. And it will push that into the record, and then the normalization rules apply on top of it. So you can then tidy things up, and that's where the Macquarie's rules then go, okay, grab all these different 85X tags and smush them all together into a single one. You can add things like changing your library location code into your NUC symbol. What else can you do? You can do things like if you wanted to create a URL based on an MMS ID. So if you really wanted to send someone to, I'm just trying to think of the type of URL where I think it might have been for a research portal or something like that. We can actually, you can do all sorts of clever things in there, but yes, you can use the normalization rules to do that. And there's many ways to do it, which makes it a little challenging.
Thanks, Peter. I understand there's a lot of interest in the Trove thing. We may need to schedule another session specifically on Trove for that interest, and just got a few more presenters to get through in this session. But yeah, if you're interested in Trove specifically, then definitely ANZREG would be interested in setting up a session specifically for that in the future. But thanks, Peter and David, on that one. Who have we got next? David again.
David again.
It's me again. Yes, I've gone too far. I know. Yep. So I'm going to try and keep this fairly brief, but I thought this was interesting. My first experience, my first encounter with OAI PMH and trying to use it for something was a complete failure. And I'm going to talk about why. It's not my fault. Sorry, I put a lot of transitions on this slide and I really shouldn't have. That was a bad idea. I'm just going to try and get some up there. So basically, this is talking about how we tried to get our medical artifacts collection to be discoverable in Primo. So a couple of problems. All of this was brand new to me. This was something I started in the middle of last year, and I'd been at Trove for about 6 months. I'd never set up a pipe in Primo back office. And come up. I'd heard about OAI PMH, but I'd never configured it. But the idea was basically pretty simple. Trove has, is that page going to forward or not? I never know. There's a little bit of a delay when we click the button, so I apologize if we're sort of being very uncertain about our slides, but okay, here we go. Trove has a digital repository, which is we call OPAL for Open Access Resources at Trove, and it's using Figshare, which is a repository software system. We have theses, we have reports, we have open publications and open data. We currently import theses and reports into Primo so that people can search for them to improve discoverability. June last year, our archives team digitized, well, they took photographs of a lot of items in our medical artifacts collection and added them to Figshare, to the Opal system. And it's, you know, a bunch of really cool stuff like syringes and medical equipment and, you know, kind of interesting things. There's 24 items. It's a small collection, but we thought it'd be great if people could search for them in Primo. And I'm going to talk about sets again, which Deborah has talked about and Peter has talked about. So Primo lets you harvest from an OAI repository by a set. And a set, obviously, we know what a set is in Alma. So from the specification, it says a set is an optional construct for grouping items for the purpose of selective harvesting. And the word there that I didn't pay attention to was optional. So I won't dwell too much about what a set means. And as Deborah said, you can actually send an OAI request, paste it into your browser, you'll get results back in your browser. You can see in red here, this is, there's two set items defined here. One is the portal 234 and one is the item type. This is how we import theses into Primo. And ignoring the data source and the normalization rules, this is the core of the pipe. So we set the data source to be Opal theses. The harvesting method is OAI. The server is obviously the Figshare server address. The metadata format is OAI_DC, so it's Dublin core. And then we've defined these two sets. The portal 234 is the La Trobe Uni collection. That's what Figshare calls institutions, calls them portals. And the set type, item type, they have a list of about 20, I think it's 25, 26 item types in Figshare. And so you can say, I want item type 8. Item type 8 in this case is a thesis. And this works beautifully. It pulls out all the theses, all the theses from La Trobe Uni, goes through our normalization rules. They turn up in our Primo, people can search for them. Works beautifully. I should point out, was set up by my predecessor. I make no claims, you know, to how well that works. And we thought, great, the medical artifacts collection should be very similar. All we need to do is define a set that selects the items in the medical artifact collection. Really straightforward. Until, sorry, I'm doing that thing where it's not. Had a look at the Figshare documentation. At this moment, the documentation says, selective harvesting can be performed using sets representing an item type, a portal institution, a category, or a month year. You can't select by collection. And because our medical artifacts collection had different item types, we couldn't just select those items. Figshare support suggested we use their API instead. They seemed quite confused that we were using OAI PMH. So it's like, oh, why are you using that? Why don't you use our API? OAI is a standard. That's why we're trying to use the standard. It's also a standard that's built into Alma. Primo. That's why we were trying to use it. I must admit that once they suggested we use their API, that's where I gave up. I've handballed it off to someone in the Trove's IT department who's got back to me and said, hey, we can do it. We have put a request to include collections as the type of set that you can query in Figshare. If you use Figshare, we would very much appreciate you supporting this feature request, which I have linked to here in the documents. And as I said, we've got someone in IT to investigate the API for us. That's a very quick summary of about 3 months of research, testing, swearing, and confusion. One of the things I found really hard was that I didn't know whether it wasn't working because I didn't know how to do it or whether it couldn't do it. And that's a classic IT thing. It's like, I don't know what I'm doing. Is it me or is it them? And it turned out in this case, it was actually them. But it did teach me a lot about OAI PMH, and therefore when it came time to do Trove, I had a much better idea of what I was talking about. And I think I'll move on from here. So handing over to Mike.
Thank you, David. Speaking of confusion and swearing, it's not time for me to talk about things. So this is just basically when we moved from Primo to Primo VE close to the beginning of last year, one of the things that we needed to consider was how we got the Whitlam Prime Ministerial Collection into Primo. Primo VE, sorry. And so the Whitlam Prime Ministerial Collection, it's part of the Whitlam Institute, but the library is the caretaker of it. 35,000 items in the collection, some of which are digitized, some of which are digitally photographed, and that's all kept within Rosetta. And Rosetta has over 21,000 intellectual entities. That doesn't mean that we've digitized 21,000 items. It just means that's how they've been set up, and all of this really predates me. So there's things we're trying to change on the go with how things are managed within Rosetta. So previously within Discovery, we, like David, we were using Primo back office, and there were pipes set up. Collection was discoverable through its own view within Primo. And so when we started to make the move to Primo VE, we said, okay, well, this shouldn't be too difficult. So we'll just go back and look at the documentation about how those pipes were set up. Back to David's point about documenting things, please document things, because it was pretty much a nightmare for us to figure out how exactly the pipes were set up and working with all their normalization rules. Pipes don't migrate when you move from Primo to Primo VE, so that's something to keep in mind if you're going to make that shift. So it was a matter of learning how to do this within Primo VE, and also more about OAI PMH itself. So part of this within Alma, you set up a discovery import profile, and that should just bring things in. Seemed straightforward until it wasn't. And that was even after repetitively consulting the Ex Libris documentation. But effectively, Rosetta as a discovery import target is not listed as an originating system. There's some reasoning behind that from Ex Libris, but your originating systems right now, I think, are limited to sort of DSpace and something else, and other. So we had to put Rosetta in as an other target. It also meant we looked at we tried setting this up, and it just kept failing and failing and failing. And eventually, because we were in the Primo VE transition period, I asked the project manager to have a look at the OAI that was coming from Rosetta. And it turns out that at some point when someone had configured Rosetta, we were including bibframe tags within the OAI PMH, which was qualified Dublin core. Sorry for all the tech speak, but effectively we added in these fields because that's how the archivists at the time wanted to manage things within Rosetta. So we had to change the XML style sheet that output the OAI PMH Dublin core feed to remove these tags that mention bibframe. So that said, if you're harvesting anything from Alma or Primo VE, keep in mind that it's got to be Dublin core or qualified Dublin core with nothing special in it, because otherwise you will have lots of headaches and swearing. So there was no documentation around these bibframe tags, so we had to basically negotiate and help the archivist understand that we weren't actually removing those fields from the record, just from the feed that then went into Primo VE. So we went through and we find this is the changing of the style sheet for the XML, and again, having to learn how to do XML coding here was a delight. And then setting up that import profile, again, pointing it towards Rosetta to harvest everything and setting up a schedule for that. It all seemed to work very, very well. And this is where we hit our normalization process tasks, which meant setting up a normalization rule, which effectively took a look at the Dublin Core information that was coming through the OAI feed and adapted things within the Primo VE record. And you'll see in this example here, there's a couple things. One, to set the discovery resource type so it appeared correctly within the facets within Primo VE was one of the normalization rules. The other one was to remove the is part of qualification, because Primo VE defaults to approximating sort of a collection, an archival collection format when it comes to those records. And there was, when we tested this with the archivist, she felt there would be some confusion around understanding what is part of meant within this collection context. So we just basically suppressed that. And we tested it, a lot of testing with that. Part of this, really a large chunk of the work came in, and we created a massive normalization rule, because these are the 85 types of media types that are within Rosetta. This is how the archivists have categorized everything, and you can see everything, and it is pretty granular. It goes down to a set of detail, but there are so there are very few base level Primo VE metadata types, so they didn't map exactly. So instead, we had to work with the archivist and say, well, you know, is it okay if we sort of bring those 3 types of audio down to just displaying an audio? We were told that wouldn't be great, so we tried to use custom types within Primo VE, but you're only allowed 20 custom types, and we're already using 3 of those. So we effectively went live with just as those content types stood within Rosetta, and we keep lobbying Ex Libris to add more custom content types. And so there are the basic outcomes of the whole project. It worked. We learned a lot about using OAI PMH. We've made the OAI feed from Rosetta available to the Museum of Australian Democracy Prime Ministerial site. We're doing other things with OAI in and around the place. So there you go. Sorry, that was a quick one.
Thanks, Mike.
Oh, and next up is Bronwyn.
I'm going to try and keep this quick. So I'm from the Digital Libraries Initiative Unit in the library at UNSW. And I'll just be talking briefly about Alma publishing to Rapid ILL and Recollect publishing to Primo. We also publish Alma journal holdings to Third Eyes, LibKey and Browsing services, and we have started the process to replace the Alma RIS exports to Libraries Australia with OAI PMH. So for Rapid ILL, so as has already been mentioned, the technical process is very similar to the process to set up exports to Trove. So I won't go into a lot of detail about that. In short, since 2018, we've set up 6 publishing sets. So 1 for print journals, 1 for print books, 2 for e-journals and 2 for e-books. And I'm sorry, we have a typo here. So for both e-journals and e-books have local only and lendable international sets. Now, I should explain what Rapid ILL is. Rapid ILL is an interlibrary loan system integrated with Alma's resource sharing management system. In order for Rapid to know what UNSW holds, publishing of our holdings to their database is necessary. So print books and print journals are fairly straightforward, and we have set them up. We did initial publishing, and we now have incremental publishing happening every Sunday morning. So basically we set it up in 2018 for print journals and print books, and pretty much, although we do monitoring every Monday morning, I don't recall there ever being significant problems with the print resources. But the e-resources are more complicated because of the complexity surrounding the licensing. So we can lend, in quotes, to international partners and domestic partners for certain e-resource material, but other e-resource material we can't lend. So that's why we need a local only and a lendable international set for each of e-journals and e-books. Local only means that we don't lend to anybody. Lendable international means that we're prepared to lend internationally. Okay, so I'll move on. So yes, so the process, like the one to Trove, you create an Alma logical set. So this is for print resources. You create a logical set in Alma. You create an Alma publishing profile. Within that profile, you have a link to the logical set. You publish a sample of records. We opened a case with Ex Libris. They had to do setup on their side. They also reviewed our sample publishing, and I think there were some corrections that had to be made on our side. When we're both happy, initial full publishing's done, that was tested, and then we set it up. And as I say, that was it. It didn't have to, we haven't really had to do very much with it since. So I'm not going to talk about the logical set because most of you know all about them. Okay, trying to move on. Okay. And this is the publishing profile. I won't talk about it either. Okay, I'll just go to the electronic resources. So we haven't been able to completely automate these processes. Instead, we semi-manually process the runs 3 times per year before the beginning of each of our 3 terms. That's a minimum. Sometimes we do a bit more than that. As I say, the process must determine which resources are available to be lent to rapid ILL partners overseas and which can't be lent. And an Alma set needs to be created for those 2 scenarios. So we did the initial setup the same way that we did the Primo setup. The print setup. But in terms of the ongoing semi-manual incremental runs, a script was created to run Alma analytics reports, which generate lists of MMSIDs. And those lists plus a set of instructions are then sent to the member of staff who's doing the run. Okay, so this is an example of the output from an e-journal script run. So it has run some analytics reports and outputted lists, and these have been attached to the email. So you've got one for Lendable International and you've got another one for e-journals local only. Then in the body of the email, you're told the counts for each case. And then there are a list of the steps you need to do to complete the update. Okay, so conclusions. As I say, print resources setup, very straightforward. No major issues since the initial setup. Electronic resources more complex due to the need to create lendable international and local only publishing sets for each run. In theory, the entire process could be automated using Alma set APIs. So if you go to the developer network, you'll see that there are APIs for managing sets. And it's things like there's an API to add a member. There's another API to delete members of the set. We did look into this. We ended up with quite a complicated script, which had a lot of fail points. And in the end, we just decided to go ahead and do the process semi-manually 3 times a year. I don't know what's happened to the numbering here, but anyway, we are looking at adding another set called Australia Only. So Rapid has an Australia Only option. This, by setting up though Australia only sets, this would minimise the number of request rejects. We are having to reject some requests from overseas libraries because the Australia only titles are part of that international only set. So yes, we think that might be worth doing. Okay, I'm going to move on to Recollect. UNSW uses Recollect to store, make accessible and preserve our university archives photographs, student publications such as the Runker and other special digital collections. To enhance the collection's discoverability, it was decided that the open access content be published to Primo. The process steps were to analyse the Recollect metadata and develop publishing specs. We then opened a ticket with the Recollect vendor requesting publishing setup. So only they can do the publishing. We can't do the publishing ourselves. So they set up the publishing. The request was for the publishing to be set up on the basis of our specs. And we also requested that our Primo environments be whitelisted. The vendor then configured publishing based on our specs. And then in the Primo back office, UNSW configured, set up the configuration to harvest the publishing. And the final step was to schedule daily harvests in the Primo back office. Okay, so this is just an example of the field mapping that we sent to the Recollect vendor. You've got our Recollect fields on the left and the OAI PMH publishing fields on the right. And that's just some sample publishing. This is just the setup for a harvesting pipe on the Primo side. And this is a sample of records within the Primo display. So conclusions, publishing specifications development was fairly straightforward. We're quite familiar, having used Recollect for 3 or 4 years, we're quite familiar with the data. Vendor was very responsive and able to set up publishing quickly. The Primo office, the Primo back office setup was quite complex. I say that if you're familiar with the Primo back office, it was reasonably straightforward, I guess, but it's, yes, definitely more than a 5-minute job. The next steps are to publish the content to Trove. We've had a ticket with Trove since December, but I think they're concentrating on other projects such as Alma to Trove. And also we intend to go live with VE in September. And as part of that, we will include the Recollect records in Primo VE. And that was the end of my section. So I will pass. Oh, whoops, gone too far. So I'm passing over to Rich.
Kia ora koutou, everyone. I'm Rich and I work at the National Library of New Zealand and I work in the collection description teams here. We describe the publications that we collect under legal deposit. Today I'm going to talk briefly about publishing the metadata from those descriptions into discovery and preservation. So for discovery, we publish to the National Library Search, and that's the main discovery search found on the National Library website of New Zealand. And it aggregates metadata from Alma, the published collections, and also the unpublished collections, papers past, and Index New Zealand and the website itself, and a whole bunch of other sources. And it provides a kind of good starting point for searchers coming to the library and looking for resources. The records that are indexed on this search are also searchable on search engines. So lots of our users come directly via a Google search, for example. And this National Library search is managed very ably by the digital experience team at the National Library. And so to get our Alma records into the search, we have a publishing profile that's publishing MARC records every day. It's from a set of all unsuppressed records in our Alma. And the digital experience team use an in-house tool that they've developed called Supplejack, which is used to harvest the records. And so every day that's picking up the new and updated and deleted records from Alma. And they have a parser script within their Supplejack that will crosswalk the MARC records that we're publishing into digital NZ metadata standard, which is itself based on Dublin core and some local digital NZ attributes. And the records are then exposed to the national NetLib search. So the question kind of came up in the last year or so, could we crosswalk our MARC records to Dublin core to make it more convenient for the Supplejack harvest? And so I did a bit of work looking at that, and Alma does have a crosswalk into Dublin core from MARC, but it wasn't really that feasible at the time because a lot of the metadata isn't really crosswalked out of that particular crosswalk. And for example, some examples there from the MARC record, the publisher information from 264 field, holding information, descriptive information from the 300 field. If you know MARC, you'll know that's some important stuff there. But it was a really good kind of exercise just to for me to learn about setting up publishing profiles and how this kind of worked. And also, I have noted that just recently in the February release, there's now a configurable crosswalk that you can do yourself, and maybe we'll look at that again at some point. And so another thing that we've done to support the NetLib search is we've created an additional publishing profile. This is where we have a targeted set of records that we want to republish. For example, the National Library search may want to enable new functionality or to address legacy issues with the data. And so we use for example, we have recently there's been a new function called a filter for maps in the National Library search. So to enable that with our Alma records, we use this profile. So we created a set of map records and we added that set to this particular publishing profile, and then could manually run that in conjunction with the digital experience team running their harvest of that data. So it's been really, really useful workflow to have outside of the regular publishing and harvesting process. So without overloading those processes, for example. And finally, I'll briefly touch on Alma publishing to Rosetta. It's not really my area of expertise, but I thought it would be good to generally kind of describe this. So here, OAI publishing is part of a bigger digital workflow. And it kind of starts when Legal Deposit receives a digital publication and they create a record within Alma. And then they archive the publication in Rosetta. And at that point, they're associating the item in Rosetta with the MMS ID of Alma. And there's an Alma API call at that point as well. It goes back to Alma and adds a digital rep to that record. And then this is where we have the publishing profile. It's a separate one for Rosetta, and it publishes at the digital rep level. So when that rep's added, it triggers a publish of that record, and that goes back, that gets picked up by the Rosetta harvest to get the digital rep ID from Alma and add it to the intellectual entity record in Rosetta, creating that kind of one-to-one between an IE and a digital rep in Alma. And then finally, when we catalog the resource, we may actually change, the title or other metadata within the bibliographic record in Alma. So those updates also get picked up by the same publishing profile, and they update the IE descriptive record. So that's a very quick run over my topic, very of time, but yeah, I'll finish there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Rich, and thank you, everyone. I realise we've run over a few minutes over time, and you probably still have questions. We will be making this recording and the slides available on the list in the next couple of days. So I'm sure that if you have any other questions for any of the presenters or just the community in general, that the list will be able to help you in that. So thanks, Deborah, who I think has had to go, and David and Mike and Peter and Bronwyn and Rich for your time and your expertise. It was very interesting. But yes, I'll let you all go because we are a little bit over time. And for me, I get to go home now because in New Zealand, it's home time. So yeah, thank you very much for all your time and expertise. Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.